This is a closer look with the Monitor. I'm Craig Blumenshine from Prairie Public. Theodore Roosevelt's influence on North Dakota is impossible to overstate. His time in the Badlands helped shape the man who became the nation's 26th president, and the legacy is woven into the state's identity through parks, monuments, and now the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. But Roosevelt's story is also more complicated than many people realize. A recent investigation by North Dakota Monitor reporter Jacob Orledge explores Roosevelt's own words about race and Native Americans, the impact those beliefs had on federal policy, and how historians and the new Presidential Library are presenting a fuller picture of one of America's most influential presidents. Jacob joins us now for a closer look with the Monitor. Jacob, how are you today?
I'm doing okay. Thanks, Craig.
Why was this the right time for you to report on this story as the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library prepares to open?
Well, this is a big moment for North Dakota. We have this presidential library that's opening, that's been built, that is being dedicated this week. And I wanted to look at an aspect of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy as a man and as a president. We obviously hear as North Dakotans a lot of stories about his time in the Badlands, his policies as president, how many aspects of his legacy continue to pay dividends for the United States to this day.
Jacob, before we get into the details of your writing, what central question did you want your story to answer?
Well, Craig, the central question that I wanted answered in my article were how Native Americans feel about Teddy Roosevelt and the library that's going to bear his name. And also, as a secondary question, how the library is going to approach this part of his legacy. What we hear less about, or what I perceived us as hearing less about, was his views on race and Native American voices on this topic. In addition to some of those primary source documents, I also spoke to a wide-ranging group of Native Americans, historians, and North Dakotans. And the almost unanimous view is that he made a lot of remarks in his lifetime that are quite frankly racist. Robbie Loff, the executive director of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, was recently at a Prairie Public event where he said that he doesn't even want to repeat some of the remarks that Teddy Roosevelt made during his lifetime on race and Native Americans. One of the most infamous quotes that Roosevelt said from an 1886 speech in New York, he said, quote, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th, end quote. And a lot of these remarks, a lot of these quotes that you see from Roosevelt on race are still hurtful to Native Americans to this day. I spoke to Scott Davis, the former executive director of the North Dakota Indian Affairs Commission, and he said that a lot of tribal leaders still remember that quote like it was yesterday. Now, there are some caveats to this. Those were common views at the time. And Roosevelt's family, I spoke to a member of that family, Serena Roosevelt. They say that Roosevelt changed his views later in life and that he evolved as a person and that he was ashamed of some of his earlier remarks. But there doesn't seem to be much doubt that he made a lot of racist remarks during his lifetime.
Jacob, I'm curious, beyond the rhetoric, how did those beliefs influence the policies Roosevelt supported or pursued while he was president?
Teddy Roosevelt supported several policies while he was president that resulted in long-term harm to Native Americans and Native American communities, consequences that are still being felt today. Many historians I spoke to emphasized that it's important to bear in mind many of these policies began before Roosevelt was president and ended well after he left office. But those same historians say it's also fair to hold Teddy Roosevelt accountable for the policies that he supported and helped to implement. Among those policies were the Allotment Acts, which, to summarize a very complicated process, was essentially privatizing land that had previously been collectively held by tribal nations. Among the consequences from that policy is the checkerboard of property ownership that you see on some reservations. The overall goal here, from Teddy Roosevelt's point of view, was to try and assimilate Native Americans into mainstream American culture. But in the end, that was not successful. But a lot of these policies did contribute to the loss of land, the loss of language, and the loss of culture that a lot of Native Americans are still struggling to repair to this day.
The Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library has said in that speech, I think that you were talking about earlier, that it wants to present a complete picture of Roosevelt, not just the inspiring parts. From your understanding, how is the library approaching these more difficult conversations?
The library and a historian associated with the library have told me that they are going to be approaching this topic head on. Their mantra has been to humanize, not lionize Teddy Roosevelt. And they've involved Native Americans throughout this process as they're developing the content of what this library is going to include. That began back in 2021, 2022. With Burgum and outreach to tribal leaders and the Roosevelt family. That initial process culminated in a blessing of the land before construction began. And that was from everybody's account, that seems to have been a very emotional day where representatives of the Roosevelt family and tribal leaders gathered here in North Dakota and shared stories. And the Roosevelt family emphasized that they do not share the views that Teddy Roosevelt so controversially expressed. And that involvement of Native American voices in the process has continued in recent years. There's an advisory council that exists and advises the library on how to better incorporate Native American history and the consequences of some of Roosevelt's policies into the library. And a lot of the Native American leaders that I spoke to are hoping that the Teddy Roosevelt Library will be a platform for Indigenous history and tell the whole story and bring Native American perspectives to the forefront rather than focusing just on the more positive aspects of Teddy Roosevelt's legacy. And so far, it seems as if the library is pursuing that tack.
Anything, Jacob, in your reporting that was genuinely surprising to you or challenged your own understanding of Theodore Roosevelt?
I would say one minor surprise I encountered early on was some surprise at the extent of Teddy Roosevelt's racism in some of his remarks and his policies, and that a lot of these policies are still resulting in consequences that are felt today.
Your story, Jacob, isn't really about canceling a historical figure. It's about understanding one more completely, I feel. What does this conversation tell us about how we should approach a complicated historical figure in general?
You're right, Craig. This is absolutely not about canceling Teddy Roosevelt or anybody else. This was a look at an aspect of TR's legacy that is not as often discussed as other parts of his time in the Badlands. One historian I spoke to said that they can't think of a perfect president. So everyone has a complicated legacy, and Teddy Roosevelt in particular was a complicated man. He's celebrated for a lot of policies that, as I mentioned earlier, continue to benefit the United States. But he also supported policies and made remarks that continue to cause harm to this day. And I think that's something that we all have to factor in when we're talking about this.
After spending so much time researching and reporting on this piece, what do you hope readers take away from it?
My goal with this piece, Craig, was to center Native American perspectives and thoughts on the library. And I hope readers can come away with a more complete understanding of that aspect of TR's legacy. And hopefully they'll have the opportunity to visit the library and see their take on a lot of these and other aspects of TR's life and legacy.
Many of us are looking forward to doing exactly that, Jacob. Jacob Orledge is a reporter for the North Dakota Monitor. His story examines the complexities of Theodore Roosevelt's legacy as North Dakota marks the opening of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. You can read his full reporting, free from paywalls, free from requirement of a subscription. You can read it at the North Dakota Monitor at northdakotamonitor.com. Jacob, thanks again for joining us with a closer look with the Monitor.
Thanks for having me on, Craig.